today, giving us a presentation. So we do not yet have a June speaker. If you're a member of the user group and interested and available for June, we would really appreciate you stepping up. Future events, these are SQL Saturday and Data Saturday events that are free mini conferences. And I wanted to call out that the Day of Data for St. Louis is on October 24th. And here's information about Gary Bell. And I forgot to copy the information from his abstract. But I'll pass this over to Gary.
Can everyone hear me on the I'm not sure we have anybody on. Do we have anybody online right now? Other than the few people in the room?
Well, it's being recorded.
Okay. Sure. So, good afternoon now, everyone. I'm Gary Bell, Covenant Technology Partners. Spoken in the future a number of times and happy to be back. Covenant Technology, for those that aren't familiar, and David, you'd like to say a few words to introduce Covenant?
Yeah, no, we're delighted to be here. Covenant's been in the technology space here in St. Louis for over 20 years, and we're active in a number of user groups and such as that. So thanks for having us, and we appreciate you keeping us dialed in here.
Excellent, thank you. So again, I'm Gary Bell. I'm a data analytics architect with Covenant Technology Partners. I've spent the entirety really of my too long now career in the Microsoft data and AI space, going back to SQL Server, and then certainly most recently into the Power BI and Azure space. And so we're going to talk a little bit today about application lifecycle management in data or DevOps kind of stuff that includes the CI/CD in Fabric. This, I mentioned my background being in data or database development, coming in from that. This is a bit of a paradigm shift for those of you that like me, have that kind of a background. What this is, if I move forward here, what Fabric is finally kind of enabled, and this has been a journey for Microsoft for a number of years, but we've finally gotten to the point where we're it's not quite completely there, but we're almost to the point where we can treat objects in Fabric as code. And so what that means is that we can the objects themselves are stored as typically some kind of JSON definition or kind of schema metadata definition within Fabric. And what that really unlocks for us is the ability to treat all these objects as code. And once we can do that, we can begin to adopt a lot of the tried and true DevOps lifecycle management capabilities and frameworks and processes that have been in use for a number of years in more of the true developer space. So if you're coming at this from that kind of a background where you've done dev work before and you're familiar with source control and GitHub and branching and a lot of those things, then you're going to be ahead of the game. This what we're going to go through today kind of shows you how to do a lot of that with in the Fabric environment. But again, if you're like me and kind of that's a bit novel because you've been doing database development in the past, and traditionally there have been ways to do some source control and some DevOps and data ops kind of things in the data space. There's still some hiccups here that we'll talk about, but I think it's fair to say that this is closer than I think we've ever been to kind of this true kind of end-to-end approach to it. So that's kind of what ALM or Application Lifecycle Management is. We're trying to standardize a lot of the processes. For those who worked in Power BI in the past, this hasn't always been easy. Power BI well, for the longest time, it was not really possible at all in a real sense. And they made baby steps along the way, and now I think what we're seeing is that we kind of finally start to realize some of that vision. So again, this would allow us to provide just more control, governance, standardization around the processes that maintain and track the changes to our code, to our objects in Fabric, as well as the process to deploy those from workspace to workspace and make changes. So the value really here is, as it talks about here at the bottom, version control and just that reliability that I just mentioned. Version control in Power BI or in Fabric has again kind of crept along. We'll talk about some of that in a minute. But this really finally gives us the ability to finally do true version control, as opposed to what I see a lot of places is semantic model version 1.0, or you've got multiple copies of the same semantic model in the workspace to try to track different changes or work on different things, for example. Or potentially having to pull a copy of a semantic model report out of Power BI altogether and track it in your own, whether that's a GitHub repo or your own source control system. Again, kind of a very manual process like that. When we can finally treat this as more as code, more as these objects as code, we can much more easily collaborate on these objects than we have been able to do in the past. One of the struggles with creating, for example, a large kind of enterprise semantic model has been it's difficult for more than one person to work in a semantic model at a given time. It's certainly in the traditional kind of Power BI desktop sense. If you've got it open and you're making changes to one fact table, and your coworker wants to focus on another fact table, and theoretically you're kind of staying out of each other's way, you're still going to get into at best some kind of merge conditions. At worst, if you're not using any of these kind of tools, you're just going to overwrite one another's changes, and it's going to cause problems. So again, for something like a enterprise semantic model, that can get quite large and quite complex, and really needs multiple developers to have their hands in it. This goes a long way to getting that. And then again, just the ability to put some maybe guardrails, some governance around the deployment processes. Depending on how you have it set up right now, we'll talk about maybe Fabric pipelines here in a moment as one solution that kind of currently exists kind of prior to this. But maybe even prior to that, it was really just kind of downloading a file and uploading it to a new workspace in Power BI, for example. It was the deployment process. But we'll talk about some of the things that this framework or this approach kind of enables for us, and some of the really neat things we can do potentially with some of the continuous development kind of framework. So I've kind of touched on it a little bit, but just to kind of set the stage here for kind of what it looks like today, or what a lot of people, a lot of companies that we see are doing. This is not a judgment by any means. Microsoft has caused this, I think, because they pushed Power BI out before they really had a solution to this problem years ago. And so what we see as what I see as a consultant and dealing with a lot of clients in there, as I see that what they've done in their environments, how they're set up, kind of what processes are in place. I think it's fair to say that most organizations are pretty immature in this space. And again, that's not because of maybe even a lack of want, but it's because Microsoft has not made this process easy. Again, going back as recently as a couple years ago, it was almost impossible to do any kind of source control on something like a semantic model. A semantic model downloads as a PBIX file. The PBIX file contains data, And so what you would typically end up with in any kind of enterprise environment is you have semantic models that can get into the hundreds of megabytes into the gigabytes in terms of size. That doesn't play well with GitHub, even if you wanted to kind of manually pull it out and suck it in. So that was a challenge. And they've kind of made some steps to make some of that easier. They did introduce the concept of deployment pipelines a number of years ago now, and those have kind of continued to evolve and improve. We'll talk a lot about those today because those aren't going away, and those are not. This is not necessarily replace that, but we'll talk about kind of the differences between the two. But that helps. The pipelines allowed you to at least put a little bit of framework around moving items from a workspace up in from like a dev test prod is typically the way organizations set those up. But as I'll show you here in a minute, those are somewhat limited. It's kind of the easy button version of really what we're going to get into in terms of some of the automation that's possible. In that it's kind of a no code environment where you do have the ability to kind of see what's changed between items. Actually, that's a fairly recent innovation as well. But you can also begin to maybe remap the sources and things like that when you push those up in a deployment pipeline. But it still doesn't support. It still lacks the support for the collaboration that I mentioned a moment ago. That doesn't really solve that problem. And of course, it's still not source control. It's better to have a version in dev test and prod. You've got 3 versions of a data set, so that in case somebody really screws something up and makes and does something so that you want to recover from, you could typically maybe go get the versions from another. But again, there's no change tracking. There's no I can see who made the change and what changes were made, that kind of stuff. So it's certainly not a solution for that problem. So we're going to talk about Git integration in Fabric is kind of step 1 of what this process involves or kind of how it works. So as the name implies, this allows you to integrate a GitHub repository directly in a workspace in Fabric. You've got a couple different options for which style you can use. We'll look at that here in a bit. But again, this is made possible because we can now treat Fabric items as code in Fabric. This is, as I mentioned kind of a moment ago, this is metadata or kind of schema information only. It's not data. So the example I gave a moment ago was for a semantic model. Semantic models or those kind of PBIX files, if you download them, typically have data associated with them. What this is going to capture is really just the structure of a semantic model as one example. They've extended this now to include, I would say, most, I've got a slide here in a minute that kind of walks through it, but most objects in Fabric, although they keep adding objects to Fabric and they're trying to kind of keep up so that it does trail a little bit. There are a few exceptions that we'll talk about. And there's a lot of ongoing development. Certainly the goal is to make more or less everything in a Fabric workspace be able to kind of devolve down to kind of this code or metadata layer and be able to treat as code and then be able to work with Git for source control purposes. So this allows us to do all again, kind of the modern DevOps kind of approach to maintaining a code base. And that's really what this becomes, as a code base. And so again, if that's your background, if you understand that and worked in that environment before, we have the ability to do all of the typical GitHub kind of activities like branching our code out, which we're going to show an example of as we get into some of the demos, creating pull requests to kind of merge branches that we've created back together or into new branches. We can do code reviews. We can even do some automation around code reviews and some other things we'll talk about, and automation just in general. So that I think that's really where it really maybe what I want to kind of take away, what I want you to take away from our discussion today is all the things that could potentially be possible here. This is going to be a really open-ended framework that you can do a lot with. And I'll show you kind of what that looks like, and we'll do a really simple example I intentionally didn't want to go through. In fact, I've looked at a few other kind of presentations on this topic over the last week or two, and there's some that get really in depth and all the different and you can really go nuts with this stuff. And it's really impressive what some people do. I wanted this to be pretty approachable. I didn't want to kind of throw a million things at it. So we're going to get started very simple, and we're going to start with a really simple example, and then we can start talking about how you can extend that and other options and where you can go from there. And so the pipelines themselves. So you can even turn the automation or the pipelines that move content from workspace to workspace or branch to branch. You can code those as well. Create something called YAML files. Typically, is the way those are created in Azure DevOps or in GitHub. And they structure kind of what happens, and they have various triggers, and we'll look at through one of those as well. That's where really some of the exciting stuff can happen in terms of how you can really evolve your processes or the way that this works.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm kind of in a way surprised that they're doing this as a YAML file versus the format that they use for like their Azure Data Factory. They have an ARM template that's all like JSON files.
Yeah.
I'm kind of
I think you can use a JSON approach. There's a couple of frameworks that you can work with as well that can kind of do something similar. I've seen some examples along that lines. I couldn't speak to why they've kind of standardized around YAML. I don't know if that was something that Git had already standardized around or GitHub had already standardized around and they just kind of adopted it. We're going to look at most of our examples today in Azure DevOps, but it's still all focused around a Git repository in Azure DevOps. And DevOps, of course, just put some window dressing on GitHub as well. So yeah, I can't really speak to why the decision was made. We'll show an example of a YAML file. I will maybe we'll have a chance to talk about. There are some Python libraries out there that allow you to kind of automate some of this stuff too. That maybe simplify it even more than it already is. Although I think it's pretty straightforward as is. But the key, it kind of reminds me of the Azure ecosystem itself. You know, you get into Azure and there's a million different things that you can stitch together and lots of different ways to do it. This is very open-ended as well. There are a lot of different approaches you can take here. There's not really one right way to set this up in terms of structuring it from a best practices standpoint. We'll look at a couple maybe today and talk about some others. But really it's going to be about what fits best with your team and your organization. And maybe even integrate with some of the things that your organization may already be doing in the DevOps space. They kind of pull it under one umbrella, at least standardize some processes that way. Or you could separate it again. It's going to be different if you're a big team that's doing a lot of maybe data engineering and notebooks, things like that in Fabric versus a smaller team that's really just doing some Power BI and reporting stuff. So
is there a library that comes with it that's going to set most of these things up? Like, you know, Databricks has a what is it, automation bundles.
mm-hmm.
They have declarative automation bundles. They have something that for Fabric, so I don't have to like do everything as a code and then build my repos that's there.
There's a website that I'll show you guys at some point that's got a number of, I think they're all Python libraries that make some of them. There's a bunch of them that are made by the community, and there's a half dozen or so that Microsoft officially produces and supports.
That's great.
Some of those can be, there's one specifically that I don't remember if it's a Microsoft focused or developed one that specifically deals with CI/CD stuff. And I have played with it a whole lot, but maybe we can take a peek at it. There are others that do other kind of Fabric related things that we may talk about as being something you can automate as part of your processes. And so there's some stuff out there that
Awesome.
can
Thank you.
help you with that. Yeah. All right. So before we get in, I'm going to jump into demo here in a little bit, maybe just a slide or so. But I did want to talk briefly about requirements, just to level set, make sure that everyone understands what's involved here, what's necessary. From a licensing standpoint, you do have to the entry bar here is a capacity of some kind. Now that could be a fabric capacity, and that, by the way, that starts all the way down to the lowest possible level. They have 2 levels, so that's the one that you can get into for a couple $100 a month. You can even use it on a trial, which they're still very generously handing out regularly. If you still are on an old Power BI premium capacity, I don't know if that's possible anymore. I think they're trying to phase those out, but that would still qualify. And I believe, I've just kind of seen mixed signals here. I tried it out. It looked like this worked, but even if you're using a Power BI premium per user workspace, so if you've got premium per user licensing in your organization, again, the caveat there is that everybody involved is going to have the premium per user license to access the workspace and use all this stuff. So I mean, it's a fairly low bar. I mean, I think most organizations have dipped their toes into the Fabric capacity space. Again, if not, you can get started super easy by starting out with a trial or maybe even something as low as an F2. It's pretty minimal in terms of the licensing capabilities or requirements, rather. The Git providers, as I mentioned, we're going to look at Azure DevOps. The cloud version, I guess I didn't even realize that I guess there's an on-prem version of GitHub that's not supported. So it's just the cloud versions of Azure DevOps or the kind of GitHub proper. Those are the 2 options that we have. You'll see here in a moment. There's a quick note here that it does behoove you to keep your repository in the same region as your Fabric tenant. I think that's done really at your enterprise level for your Azure DevOps, for example. And I couldn't even tell you how you go about selecting a region for GitHub. I assume that's a setting in there somewhere. It's just kind of a recommendation there. I think it's going to make everything work a little bit more seamlessly and a little faster. I don't know if there are going to be egress charges if you go across regions like they occasionally will charge. Again, we're not dealing with massive amounts of data here. Typically, this is just text files with code. So mileage may vary there. In terms of authenticating, I guess the real highlight here is that you can now use service principals when you're interacting with Azure DevOps, which enables a few things. In fact, we've got one set up in one of the demos I've got here later. But typically, that's just an Entra authentication. But again, that's been extended here fairly recently to include service principals across all workloads there. If you're using GitHub, GitHub authentication is a little different. They use something called personal access token there, so just get that set up. And then finally, on the just kind of broadly speaking, in terms of the constraints here, as we've mentioned already a couple of times, there's no data involved here that can present a few limitations or challenges or just kind of caveats as we walk through some of these, and we'll talk about what that looks like for things like databases and lakehouses and things like that. Because although you can kind of get the schema for something like a database and push that from or into your repository and then push that up to another workspace, when you kind of stand it up in the other workspace, you're going to have to rehydrate it with data. Again, that's hopefully if you've got that set up properly, you've probably got notebooks that maybe take care of that, or maybe you have data pipelines that populate a database. And we can even talk about scenarios where part of this deployment, this continuous deployment, can not only create your database in the new workspace, but also automatically run a pipeline or a notebook that will populate it with data potentially as an option as well. So any other questions about requirements or what it takes to get started here? And then just finally, kind of a note, I've mentioned these maybe a few times. Just about everything right now is supported, or at least on that track. There are a few new, I think the data agents maybe that's just been added, support for data agents. Data agents themselves are fairly new. Some of the real-time analytics stuff has recently been added to this as well. As far as I'm aware, everything on the in Fabric right now is either supported to some extent or on the roadmap to be supported, with the exception of dashboards. I think Power BI or Microsoft rather is beginning to treat kind of these the dashboards in Power BI as a bit of kind of a legacy item. And I don't know what the technical challenge is under the hood, but they're apparently they are not supported today, and apparently they are not on the roadmap to be supported in the future. I don't see a lot of people using dashboards anymore. I don't know we have any big dashboard users out there, but those, if you were, would have to be manually migrated. The limitations there that I mentioned around lakehouses, databases, is the item I just mentioned, that the data does not come with them. In fact, the database, a database, whether that's a data warehouse in Fabric or a SQL database, I don't know either. They're starting to do, you can do a Cosmos database, I think, in Fabric now. They're starting to expand that as well. I don't know what that looks like here in terms of Git support just yet, but the databases will typically bring their schema over. So you'll get, you know, your definitions of your tables and columns and maybe your procedures and things like that, views. Again, you just won't have data. The challenge potentially with those is if you are moving data from workspace A to workspace B, workspace B already has the database deployed. It's already populated with data. You already loaded it up with data, and now you make a change to the schema that somehow potentially could be destructive, data destructive. Maybe you change the size of a field from 100 to 50 or something like that, or any number of other things that could potentially be destructive. They are actively working on ways to make that a little more seamless. There are some things right now that I think they'll warn you about, some things that may cause challenges, but that's an active area of development. Microsoft's intent is to automate that to the maximum extent they can, and kind of take care of behind the scenes some of the kind of data affecting changes that could pop up there. On the lakehouses, the story is a little different on lakehouses. Lakehouses, again, are a bit of a virtual database. They're all based on files that exist within the OneDrive, One Lake environment. So when you move a lakehouse, and you see the definition of a lakehouse, it's pretty thin. What you see is really kind of the name of the lakehouse itself, maybe some of the settings. If you have shortcuts defined to other areas, other OneLake files or otherwise, those will come over. But the tables within your lakehouse, the schema, since that's all file driven, those don't kind of come through with your environment or with your code. So that makes it doubly important that you have those processes that define those, defined in typically probably a notebook in Fabric, and port those along with it. So you would create your lakehouse, and you would have potentially a series of notebooks that would load data into that. You know, if you've got maybe a big transaction table that exists in one lake somewhere, you can still point to that same file, but the notebook would have to run to kind of create it and create the table in your lakehouse and then populate the table as well. And that said, you could potentially get into scenarios where you automate that part as well. But you may want to be careful on how you do that. You want some checks to make sure you're not loading it just to load it if you don't need to, or there could be, you know, if you're loading a lot of stuff, if you're loading an entire warehouse or lakehouse from scratch, there are some implications in terms of your capacity utilization as well. You want to be careful of them. So there's a couple of limitations there. There are probably a few others that I haven't mentioned here, but those are maybe the big ones that can keep your eye on at this point. Again, it doesn't mean they're not supported for lakehouses and databases. There's just a little bit of extra work usually involved when you're automating those. Any questions about that? And I think we're going to jump over into, and we'll just show you how to get this set up from scratch. at least fingers crossed, I'm going to do that. I'm going to try to kind of undo because I've got to work through this here. So I've got kind of a sample workspace in my environment. And maybe before we do that, actually, let's jump over to DevOps itself, because you do need to have a project already created. You cannot create a project here when you're setting up the integration. So let's do that. I've got a project already out here. It's just called Fabric Demo. I'm going to go ahead and create even another repository in here. So you can, as you can see here, you can create multiple repositories or repos in a project here. I don't really like doing this from a best practices standpoint. Again, it will depend on your environment. I'm kind of more in favor of a single repository and then just creating folders that kind of manage that. We can talk through some of that. I'm really going to create a new repository now, just so I get a kind of a blank one here that we can kind of play with, that we can push code into and go from there. So let's call this STLSSUG. So we just need to give it a name. It's going to have a single file in here. It's going to create kind of your default main branch when you get started. We'll go ahead and create that. It sticks a README file out there just so there's something there. But otherwise, this is an empty repo here with a single branch in. And so the only thing we see, not completely empty, it's got a README file in it that was kind of generically created. So starting with that, and again, this assumes you already have even a project. If you need to go into your DevOps environment, you may need to even create a new project if you're kind of starting from scratch. But that's usually pretty straightforward as well. So we're going to start with our empty repo, and then we're going to jump over to Power BI and see if we can get this one hooked up to work with our workspace. So this is up in workspace settings. You should see this Git integration on any workspace that's already assigned. You may see it even on workspaces that aren't assigned to capacity. It may just be kind of grayed out or something. But on any workspace that kind of meets the requirements, you should see Git integration. You can see I already had one set up. I'm going to go ahead and disconnect it here and just take it back down to nothing. The first time you get over here, it will ask you to kind of enter your credentials. Again, this is typically just your Entra account. If you're using Azure DevOps, if you're connecting to, I'll go ahead and log out of that and get all the way back here to the beginning. So this is in a new workspace or kind of a workspace that hasn't been hooked up before. You'll see the two options. You've got the DevOps and GitHub. We're going to stick with DevOps today. So I'll select that. If you hadn't logged in before, it'll ask you to add your account. And then we connect. At that point, it'll go out to your GitHub environment, your Azure DevOps environment. If you're connected to multiple organizations like I am, you're going to drop down. You're going to go find the project we created, which is Fabric Demo. And then I created, as I said, I've got a third now repo in there, kind of top level repo. We're going to just use this new one that I just created. It's empty. And then once you know what branch you want to connect to or tie this to, we only have the single branch out here right now. We'll talk about what that looks like here in a moment. And then this starts to speak to how we organize content within our folder. And as I said, you'll need to put some thought into how you want to structure your repo. Again, I would be in favor of maybe a single repo and with different folders for maybe different workspaces, or breaking it down that way. Why don't we even so I'm going to start with, I'm going to call this, we're going to create a default or a kind of a root level folder called Fabric. And then we can even kind of map this to the workspace. So we'll just call this Fabric. Mimics the, oops. Now let's do that. So this is going to create two folders. It's going to create a Fabric folder and a Fabric tenant inventory, and it's going to put all of the objects that we have. And I've got series of work of notebooks, lakehouse, and I think I stuck a semantic model and report in here as well. Oh, there should be a button down there that says save. Where's that? Huh. It's like you got the. Well, it's always something when you do a live demo, right?
Yep.
You have to step through that again if it didn't save it. And see, there's the connected sync button. It disappeared on me. Okay, let's do that again. And okay, there's the button. Should report. So we'll do that. We'll connect it. It's warning us, hey, I don't have that folder, so we'll go ahead and create that folder. And so now it tells us we're connected. Now it tells us we're syncing. Once you're connected to a repo or if Git integration turned on, you'll start to see this source control kind of banner up there at the top. And that should keep you informed of any differences. So as soon as we make a change here, that should highlight it and say that this is different than the version in source control and give us the ability to kind of we'll see the differences and then check those in. I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. But starting off here, showing you that we're syncing, and now it says that we've got zero differences. I'm going to go ahead and pop back over into our repo, and we should, so I refresh that. And we've got our folder. We should have a subfolder there for Fabric tenant inventory, and now we've got the code really definition of all of those items. So notebook. I've got a number of notebooks. I've got a report. Again, even, and this is maybe some of the big improvements they've made over the last few years to be able to define even something like a Power BI report or a Power BI semantic model is what you see right below it, completely in code. In fact, we can kind of open up one of these and look at kind of what it looks like. I think that the definition of a semantic model is kind of interesting here, where you can get the so this is, I think, a fairly simple semantic model, but you see the tables listed here, and you can kind of go into each, see the, I think this is a best example here, but you kind of see the definition of the model itself, or the different columns that are involved, and data types, et cetera. You should even be able to see the kind of the Power Query M behind it at some point. Yeah, there it is. It's a real simple one down here. So all of it's in here, and it's just all tracked in code, and as changes are made to it, we can track those differences and deploy them as necessary. So that's all in GitHub. That's all it took to make our changes, or rather to get them here. Check back out. As I said, it's the source control button will highlight any changes. There's nothing there yet, but if we just go in, I've just got this kind of dummy notebook that I've been kind of iterating on. And if we just go in here and create another test comment, just make a change to this in some way. It shouldn't save automatically up there. And then if we jump back to our workspace, after a moment, that should show up with a red one, I think. Sometimes you may have to kind of click on it, force it to go look. There you go. So it's going to highlight anything that's changed. Once it highlights that, you can kind of see the differences. So you get the code diff kind of version here right in line. And so you can see that the new version's got this extra line in it. Of course, if we were making more significant changes, you'd have a lot to go through. So you could potentially review these changes. If you had to merge differences, you could do that here as well. But again, this allows you to kind of highlight those. And so if we want to go ahead and kind of check that in into our repo, we could just come in here and commit it. You can create your commit message as well. Test added, and then just commit it. And that's just going to basically kind of upload it to our main branch. Now again, where this workspace is tied to the main branch. It may not be something that well, we could talk more about strategy in terms of branching here in a moment, but that's going to write it directly back to the main branch. You know, if we jump back over here, you should see that now in the test notebook. Not only that, you'll see that just now we made a change, test comment added, so you get the full kind of DevOps experience here. You can kind of see all the changes and track those over. Yeah.
How does this work for Power BI? Because if I'm publishing stuff from Power BI desktop, I mean, ideally with the incremental refresh stuff, normally I just do like a day or two worth of data and then change that stuff there. But people normally like load it with data. But if it is code based, how am I changing the data in the data set?
If you just changed it, for example, if you've got a semantic model out there and you're not making any changes to it, it's just got a refresh schedule and it's pulling in new data every day, then GitHub's not going to see any differences. It's not looking at the data. If you make a change to the model, if you add a new DAX calculation, for example, that would be picked up. If you're doing that in Power BI desktop and you're making some changes there, and then when you've kind of tested it out there and you're ready to push that up or publish it, at that point, it'll publish out, it'll kind of overwrite the version that's already out there. And at that point, it will recognize in that little interface we showed you a moment ago, should recognize there's a change. And so, we'll talk about different automation strategies at some point. You could, for example, set up an automated pipeline that just goes out and runs every night and just automatically checks in everything that's in your dev workspace, for example, so that you don't have to kind of manually worry about it. And that would just be kind of a good process that would be sitting out there and just essentially kind of taking daily snapshots. If nothing's changed, nothing will get checked in. But if it senses something, then it'll check that in for you. So that might be a good pipeline to set up to kind of automate that process for you. Otherwise, you can kind of manually do it, like we just showed. But you certainly still work in the Power BI desktop realm in that tool, and that really this process doesn't change that necessarily. Although we'll talk about maybe how you can go about doing something similar, or maybe some other options there as well. All right, so that was the basics of just kind of how to get started, right? So now we've got a workspace. It's attached to a repo, a specific branch in a repo. It's worth mentioning here that that as you kind of saw in the configuration there, that workspaces map to a branch in your repo one-to-one. There's no multiple branches per workspace or other way around, multiple workspaces per branch. No, I guess you could probably do that. You could probably create multiple. Yeah, you could do that. I'm sorry. You could create multiple workspaces all tied, both tied to the same branch. I'm not sure you want to do that. It might cause some confusion, but so typically you want to stick one there. There's a lot of different ways to set that up in terms of your workspace configuration and how you want to approach that. The one that I got a little diagram of maybe at the end, I think, is shows you really just working in the dev workspace connected to a branch in your DevOps environment, and then still using something like or still using fabric deployment pipelines to still take care of moving from dev to test to prod. And that's a feasible approach. We'll talk more about that in detail later. All right, let me jump back to a few other slides here because I didn't want to talk about since we've talked a little bit about both Git and then deployment pipelines. As I mentioned just a moment ago, is highlighted at the bottom. These are not mutually exclusive. They're not. The Git integration is not meant to replace deployment pipelines, although it can do some of the same things that deployment pipelines can do. The first three things here are the big maybe the big differences in terms of deployment pipelines are not meant for version history, at least not in a true sense, right? You could have, as I said before, just having multiple workspaces with the same content is I guess a form of version history, but not a good one. So Git integration gives you version history, gives you all the branching support, the code review, pull request kind of stuff. Those are all things that deployment pipelines really don't cover at all. Where there's some overlap here, these next few, the environment promotion. So that's kind of the bread and butter of deployment pipelines is take objects from workspace, your dev workspace, and push it to your test workspace, for example. And it's pretty good at that. It gives you some options again to kind of remap or rebind objects. So for example, you have a semantic model that sources from a dev SQL server somewhere, and as you push the test, you may want to connect it to your test SQL server somewhere. You can create what do they call it, a deployment pipelines, a variable or a variable. Yeah. You can specify that so that that's taken care of automatically. You can do similar stuff well, if that's all you wanted to do, then I would suggest using deployment pipelines. That's a great tool for that. But if you want to get a little more, maybe since you're process driven, if you want to layer on some additional automation, you can do what I just described. That you can essentially recreate a deployment pipeline in a Git or an Azure DevOps pipeline as well. Now, what that would typically involve, it would be using a script of some kind and kind of call APIs that would copy content from workspace A to workspace B. So there's a little more manual work to kind of set that up for starters. And then there would be an associated kind of API or again, maybe one of these Python libraries that simplify some of that for you that would take care of some of the data source binding that I talked about as well. But you could certainly create that process in a deployment pipeline. Again, if that's all you want to do, then I would stick with deployment pipelines. But the power, as you'll see here a little later on in the Git pipelines, is that you've got quite a bit more customization. You can think of the deployment pipelines as kind of the easy approach, the no-code approach. But if you really need to customize it and do some other things, that's where some of your Git options are going to come in handy. And just the other one there, you see the environment-aware deployment. That's again one of the other strengths of deployment pipelines is being able to create those variables like we talked about. There are some things, in fact, we'll look at some of the way that Git deals with this environment aware, but typically speaking, you will have to kind of manage some of that on your own if you do it through the Git integration. And just a note there on the lakehouse replication, neither one of these still handle lakehouses, and I could probably put an item there on some of the SQL. Some of those caveats that apply, generally speaking, are going to be true regardless of which approach you use for some of those kinds of state-bound or data included options. So again, the real takeaway here is that there is some overlap between the tools. I would say that the DevOps or the Git integration here is kind of a superset of capabilities, but they don't necessarily replace one another. And there is certainly a lot of reason to potentially use them in conjunction or use them together. Just a quick note about branching, because I realize that I say this knowing that, again, I come from a database development background. This is not something that comes real using Git and GitHub is not something that initially came real native to me. So it was something I had to learn. And so just a quick definition of kind of what some of these terms are, because we're kind of throwing them around. Branching allows you to kind of take a version of your source code and create kind of another copy of it in a separate branch. Now, you typically would do this when you want to make changes. So we started with kind of that main branch, and what we're going to show here in a second is if you want to make changes to that main branch, that rather than making changes directly to the branch itself, we're going to kind of spin off our own branch. It's kind of a copy of the data. We can make changes there, test everything out there, and then we can kind of merge our changes in that branch back into the kind of into a branch, into another branch that may or may not be the kind of main branch. So we're going to talk, I'm going to show a demo here in a moment of how we can branch from that code that we started with, create a new branch and create a new workspace in Power BI to allow us to go and make changes, test our code, or do it in a workspace separate from where we started, and then merge those changes back into the main branch. So let's jump back over there and do that. I'm already taking too much time. So we've got everything in our GitHub repo. Now I'm just going to come back in here, repo, and I'm going to create a new branch. I'm going to do it here in DevOps. There are a number of ways to do this. You can do it in other tools. In fact, we may show you how to use Visual Studio Code here in a moment if I got some time. But I'm just going to create a new branch. I'm going to call this. We'll just call it Dev for simplicity's sake. It's going to have all this. Since we're branching from our main branch, it's going to have the exact same code in it that we had in main. It just again, this indicates which kind of branch we're looking at right now. So now that we have a branch, let's go and create a workspace in Power BI or Fabric to kind of map this to. So I'm going to create a new workspace. All this inventory. Spelling test. It's just an empty workspace. Again, the only caveat here is that you make sure that it's assigned to your Fabric capacity or a Fabric capacity. If you leave it as a Pro workspace or something like that, it will you will not be able to integrate with GitHub. I'm going to apply that, and then we're just going to kind of repeat that process. We're going to come over here to workspace. The difference is we're going to kind of go the opposite direction, right? We connected to GitHub before, and we kind of pushed changes to it. In this case, we're going to connect to our new branch, and we're going to pull changes down. So we'll connect, and repeat this process of setting it up. And we got to make sure we reference the right folder again. I don't know what I called it. Spelled it right. Okay, so repeat that process. We'll connect and sync here. I'm not sure what would happen if you connected it after you'd already created a few objects here. If you've got, I assume if you've got a few objects here and then a few objects there, it would probably try to kind of merge them up. If there was no overlap, it would probably just create kind of a superset. If there was a little overlap, then you'd probably get some warning about how you need to merge those changes. We're starting with an empty workspace, so we don't have to worry about it. We've connected, you see the spinner up here, and in a moment should populate it with all of the objects that we're bringing in. That's not quite all of them, but so again, I've got what I've got here is 5 or 6 notebooks, and I've got a semantic model with an associated report that doesn't look like it's made its way here just yet, and then a lakehouse. And what I want to show you here as soon as this finishes up, well, is 2 things actually. Maybe I'll jump back to the other workspace. I didn't. You notice that this has a status here synced. It's worth pointing out too that on the other one, we're just on our source one, if you will. We did have this dashboard down here. I mentioned they're not being supported, so you see that when it's flagged as unsupported. That would never made its way into our repo, and so that when we created this new repo, it did not make its way over, of course. Yeah. Okay. So we've hooked it up, and it's automatically pulled in all of the objects, save the dashboard that we talked about. We've got all of our workspace, or sorry, our notebooks. We've got our lakehouse, our semantic model. Again, I will point out that if we look at the lakehouse, you're not going to see, you're going to kind of see an empty lakehouse because, as I said, it's not pulling over the tables and schema. You're just going to get, there's nothing there. It's not pulling over the files. If you had shortcuts are kind of the one exception. If you had shortcuts defined, since those are kind of code based and don't include kind of the data itself, those will come over. But so we would have some work to do here to kind of get that redefined. Typically through a notebook would take care of that. The other thing worth taking a look at here. So we've got our objects. If we look at the lineage view, because this is some of what we talked about earlier in terms of where this is coming from. This one with GB at the end. This is our source tenant, and what you're seeing here is that. Oh, I set one up to do it differently. By default, when you pull these over, they're still taking. So I've got a notebook that's going to write, read and write to this lakehouse that we were just looking at a moment ago. But it's still connected to the one from our source database. There are a couple ways to handle this. Again, I thought I set one up to behave a little differently because there's an option. Yeah, check that in. There's an option I'll show you here for notebooks, particularly. I'm sorry, let me select it. So you see that was not pretty stressed either. One of these has. There it is. All right, so that's the inventory lakehouse. You'll see in the hover over there that is still referencing the one in the other workspace. You do have the option here when you create these. There are a couple ways you can handle this. This is probably the easiest in the settings for a notebook. You can tell it to bind to the lakehouse in the source workspace or in the new workspace. I thought I had that set up, and I was hoping to see that when we brought that over that. I forget which workbook I had set up, but that in theory should allow it when it comes over to bind to the local version in this workspace as opposed to the version that's back in the source. Again, as I said, you could also set these up as kind of a post deployment option when you synchronize these that have kind of run a script after the fact that would kind of rebind these. Or if you just have a handful of them like this, you can always go do it manually as well. But that's something to be aware of. As I mentioned, for lake houses and databases, those kind of things that have source connections, you may need to do a little work after you've synchronized things, either manually or kind of script that out a little bit. So this is again would be considered kind of good practice here, right? We want to make some changes. Maybe I want to really work on one of these notebooks and make some significant changes to it. I would spin off a branch to certainly it's easy if you drop it in here and create a new workspace. That way you kind of isolate it. And this may just be a temporary thing where you pull it over here, make your necessary changes, and then we can test them out here, run the content here, and then when we're ready to merge it back into the main branch, we can create a pull request for that. Is what that's called. But maybe kind of one of the last demo here, I want to talk about kind of the automation piece, because right now we've really just kind of been check in, check out, see if we made some change here. Where this really becomes powerful is being able to automate some of the deployment activities and customize it via deployment pipeline, not deployment pipelines, but DevOps pipelines in DevOps. So I've got one thing somewhere. There we go. All right, so I mentioned Visual Studio Code earlier. I've got that open right now. You can connect, Visual Studio Code connects very easily to a Git repository, so you can connect directly to a repo. In fact, this is other repo, so let me see. I'm just running the git clone command up there. I think I need to go get the address for our.
Usually it's connected through your organization. If you say clone, it should show up.
Giving the options up there.
Yeah. So there is if you move the share down below, yeah. The formatting, if you type a greater than symbol, it should show you those options. Yeah, you should be able to choose one of those.
Those are all my lower things. I'm just gonna copy it out.
You can type it too. If you know the repo, it's gonna give you in that drop down.
I believe all of what you're telling me. I'm just
I understand.
you're making me deviate from my script here. Oh, I can't even find it. Here it is. All right, I'm just gonna go find a location for it. It didn't like that for some reason. Of course. Okay, well, we'll do the best we can here. I don't want to futz with that because I'm starting to run out of time here, but I wanted to show you what a pipeline looks like. So there are a few things here. This is a YAML file that helps us define kind of how these pipelines work. So I'm going to jump back into DevOps here real briefly to kind of show you what these look like or where they get set up. So we've got we've got a number of areas here. We're going to we focused to this point primarily on the repo section. This is where all our files at. That's basically the source control component. The pipelines are where we get into the automation. And to create one of these, I'll just kind of walk you through it. You tell it where our data is at. In our case, it's always going to be in this Azure repo. We're going to figure out which one we want to connect to. I'm actually going to connect to this previous one I worked on just to kind of show you. And then here's the things you need. So it's essentially going to create well, if you select this option, then there are a whole bunch of different things you can connect to. I'm not proficient enough to tell you what some of the things that you can get into down there. I've been focused primarily on the YAML files. And now the only way to get one in here actually is to have it already in your repo. So you need to create it somewhere else and then refer to it. I have one already in the pipeline. That's the one we were looking at there a moment ago. I'm not going to finish this because I've already got this one created. We can look at it here in a moment as well. Here's what the YAML that defines a pipeline that I have set up. It's all pretty readable. It's not natural language per se, but it's not C# code or something like that either, or anything more machine like that. It has a few sections that you have to understand, but they're all based initially on a trigger, and there are a number of different things that you can trigger on. Right now, is this one's configured. I'll figure it. Oh. That's bigger. I'm sorry. But right now we're triggering on the dev branch in our repository. So when something is when a change is made to our dev branch, this pipeline is going to trigger. You could create triggers on any number of things. You could create a trigger, as I mentioned earlier, on a time of day. So every night at midnight, we're going to run a trigger that goes and maybe saves our changes. You can have them based on changes to a specific folder within your environment. You can have it. You can give it kind of wildcard searches, so that if you create a new branch named feature or have release in the title, you can have it do certain things. It's pretty flexible. There's a lot of things you can kind of trigger one of these deployment pipelines on. In my case, I've got it referencing a set of variables that we've shared kind of at a high level. You can kind of manually define your variables right here in line. You see down here, I've got some variables that define the service principal that I'm going to use. This just defines kind of what runs it behind the scenes. I don't typically play with that too much, but this is where it gets powerful. So now you can define the steps that occur when this pipeline triggers. What you'll see here is this first task is a PowerShell script. So the two that really open up kind of a world of options for you here is you can run PowerShell scripts here, which is what this is. You can run Python scripts, and then within the context of those two, you can accomplish quite a bit, right? So and typically what we see at that point is connecting to some APIs, which is what we're doing down here. We're getting an authentication token. And what this is going to do eventually is this one set up, say, anytime that there's a change to my dev branch, I want to go out and connect to Power BI and again, kind of get a token. And then we're going to automatically sync changes directly into the workspace that's tied to that dev branch. So that if I'm making changes, for example, locally in Visual Studio Code, which, by the way, talk about all kind of the benefits of this. Being able to bring your code, your objects, your Power BI, your Fabric objects down or items down as code into a local repo and potentially modify it here, really unlocks the power of some of these coding agents, right? Because now I can have Claude or ChatGPT or whatever codex referencing this local version of all these objects, helping me optimize and fix and change and do all these things, and then push those objects right back up. And it gives you the safety net to be able to do that, right? You've got all their code in source control, and so that if you do screw something up significantly here, or not even quite sure, sometimes these coding agents go to work, you're not even quite sure what they did, so you've got the full kind of diff capabilities. So I think that's really one of the huge value adds to being able to pull it into put it into this kind of an environment and get it all code based where you can interact with it and use the coding agents to help you. So in that example, if we were in Visual Studio Code, we've had it, for example, looking at our semantic model and helping us add new DAX calculations, or maybe optimize some of the DAX that's already there. It can make those changes, save those here, and then as soon as we commit them, send it back up into our repo. This pipeline would fire because a change has been made to the branch, and it would automatically then, as it goes through these steps here, it would connect in, it would get our token, it would find the Git credentials, and eventually get down to this update from Git. It would take that update, and then it would push that immediately into the workspace. Now, this is a pretty simple example. It's not this is something you could easily accomplish yourself by just going to pulling up the workspace and clicking that button up there that's probably turned red at that point, and then just kind of synchronizing or updating. But this again just shows you a potential use case or automation that you can begin to wire up. Again, with what you have access to from the Power BI APIs, the Fabric APIs, and then some of these other Python libraries that get layered in. Just as another example, you can easily have automate a process that might implement or enforce certain coding standards around semantic models, right? All our semantic models should not directly reference or maybe hard code a password for our SQL server or something like that, right? And make sure that it checks for things like that. Make sure that you have maybe naming conventions for your dimensions or your shared dimensions, things like that. Any number of things like that you can write rules for. There's like a best practice API that you can run against the semantic model. You can make that as part of your deployment process. Every time you save it, it's going to go out there and run that against your process and make sure that is enforced. So that's just one example. I've seen an example we showed here a moment ago how we can create a branch and then create a workspace. You can automate that process as well, so that every time, I mentioned a moment ago, maybe you have a deployment pipeline here that looks for any branch that's created with the word feature, and you're creating a feature branch to work on some new report or some new component of your data warehouse. Anytime a branch gets created with feature in its name, it would automatically not only create the branch, but it would automatically fire off and create the new workspace and configure it with the proper permissions and assign it to the right capacity and do all those kind of things behind the scenes, and just automate that process for you. So really your imagination is the limit, and for the most part, in terms of what you can automate and how you can string those series of steps or tasks together through this kind of an interface. And of course, you were asking earlier about kind of simplifying the creation of some of these YAML files. I think that there's some of the, again, the Python libraries that you can use are going to simplify a lot of the kind of just the API-ness of this, connecting the APIs. Of course, you could get the coding agents probably to help you write a lot of this too, if you tell it what you want to do, which is what I did when I was building this one out. So a lot of options in that realm as well. Yeah.
I don't know if I understood this wrong. You were talking about best practices API.
Mm-hmm.
For Power BI?
Yeah.
There's one?
Yeah.
Where is this? I don't know how I feel like I've been under the cape.
Yeah, in fact, I think I talked about that at one of the user group meetings I did previous. Yeah, at least in passing. Yeah, it's highly configurable as well. I think when I showed it off previously, it was via a notebook in Power BI. But essentially, a notebook is just Python code, and you can run Python code here. But yeah, you can define all your own rules in terms of kind of what you want to enforce, and it will kind of plow away, and I think it's essentially kind of outputs a report of some kind. That you could have it take a look at the report and essentially kind of fail your deployment if it doesn't meet criteria, for example.
Okay,
So,
I remember that. Okay, now that makes sense. Okay.
Is that from Semantic Link and Semantic
Yeah.
Link Labs?
Yeah.
you're right. Yeah, that's right.
I remember.
Mhm.
Okay. When you told me that, right? Okay. I didn't realize that's what it was. Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, Semantic Link Labs is a great example. You could pull that library into a Python script like this and do, that thing's really cool in terms of all the different options you can have there.
Thank you.
So again, I wasn't quite able to get it all to show you what it looks like here, but this is when you have one set up, it looks like this. You can kind of see the runs, and then so I just made a simple notebook update, and then a few seconds later, it just launched that thing, and then automatically synced our change back to the workspace. One example. So I know we're just about running out of time here. I think. Yeah. Oops. Yeah, so I had a couple more things. So we already talked about pipelines quite a bit. So I just kind of rehab through a little bit, but again, the purpose here, and this is the piece. So you think about the GitHub integration or the DevOps integration, in kind of the two pieces. One, you've got your source control stuff, which is where the repos are, but then the pipelines are really what make this thing sing and allow you to really do some well. As I said, I've seen examples of people that really go nuts with this and really automate the what out of their environment, and it's really cool. It's extremely powerful. It does take a little bit of work to set up, but it can be extremely powerful. Those pipelines, those YAML defined pipelines, are typically the way you would do that. And as I said, you can have those run either PowerShell or Python, and you have any number of things you can do at that point. I mentioned as well as you can kind of run those quality checks. There's also there's a tabular editor integration, so we can run through some checks in tabular editor. Although tabular editor kind of is built, I think, upon some of the best practice APIs that I already mentioned. So there's some things you can do there to just again, it's kind of build checks, right? These are the things that if you're building a typical application code, that those same kind of checks that have been in place there, right? Does it compile? Does it check out? You could, if you know that the DAX calculation should return a specific result, you could do even some data checks if you write a script kind of around some data checks that could get automated as part of the deployment as well. Security, et cetera. So that's where the pipelines come in, and kind of their use case. So just a kind of a last diagram. As I said earlier, there are 1,000 different ways you can set this up. This is just a simple version that we kind of talked about. In this environment here, we would have a feature branch where we make our changes. Now, it doesn't directly show that you're making those changes in a different workspace, but you make your change in a feature branch. You've got people making changes directly in the Fabric portal. Maybe make changes outside the portal. Those all get pushed back into the feature branch. That then gets merged back into your main branch. If that's the way you have it set up, like we do now. Once those are in kind of the environment that we set up there, once we've merged those changes back in, and by the way, that's done via a pull request. That's how you merge those changes back together. So as we made changes in that little dev workspace we set up, once we're ready to push those into our main development area, we would create a quick pull request, and that just takes care of the process of merging the code together. You can set up some custom approval processes around a pull request too. So if you've got a manager or an architect that you want to make sure that reviews the code before it gets pushed in, they can have a approval step there that make sure that everything looks good. Once that gets merged back in, then we push it back to that main branch, which syncs up with our main dev or our dev workspace. And then, so that's what that pipeline takes care of. And then we use the Fabric deployment pipelines, kind of the standard Fabric deployment pipelines, to push from our dev workspace out to, it's supposed to say test, and it's supposed to say product. Got a little sloppy with my copy and paste, sorry. So that pushes from our dev workspace, and we've got a pipeline that pushes it up to test, and then another Fabric pipeline that pushes it out into prod. With the assumption here being that you're really not making changes to code in test and prod that don't originate from your dev workspace. So those should be pretty static in the sense that you don't really need to have them directly tied into your repo. So, but again, you could set this up any number of other ways. There's a whole other conversation about workspace kind of organization and how you separate your workspaces. Between some larger organizations may have workspaces dedicated to just the data engineering kind of task, and others dedicated to to more of your Power BI kind of visualization. Then there's a conversation about repo organization. As I said, I'm kind of in favor of maybe a single large repo and then creating folders within to kind of tie to different workspaces. I think that's maybe the cleanest, because I think you will find there are some things. In fact, even if you look at the one that I created here, the structure of it, I created some kind of top level folders. This Azure Pipelines, for example, is where we keep all of those YAML files. So the example one that I've got up here is in this Azure Pipelines folder. So kind of some high level artifacts that kind of exist at the enterprise level, as opposed to individual workspaces and things like that. But again, that your mileage is going to vary there too, and your organization may already have some preferences in terms of how that stuff's set up. So again, a lot of different ways you go about doing this, a lot of different ways to implement it. But the takeaway here is I would encourage you, if you've got, particularly if you've got, if you started to really dip your toes into the Fabric space and you've got quite a bit of content built up, maybe around pipelines and notebooks and your lakehouses and those kind of data warehouse components that are true enterprise level artifacts for your organization, I think it would make sense for you to turn on or enable Git integration as soon as you can. If for no other reason right now than just the source control component, and then maybe start to dip your toes in the continuous development or continuous deployment rather pipeline aspect of the automation of it. But just being able to get those into source control is going to go a long way and provide quite a bit of peace of mind, and probably save you once or twice from some kind of mistake that'll be much more easily recovered from in that environment. So I think I'm just about wrapped up here. Any other, I think I've already kind of shown that, so I jumped ahead. Any quick questions before we wrap up? Anything else I can help clear up that may not have made sense as we were stepping through it today? I know it's a lot, so. Anything online, Julie? Great. I'm always available for questions via email, or if anybody has any follow-ups that they'd like to do, just let me know.
Sounds good. Thank you, Gary.
All right, yeah.
See ya.
See you. That'll stop it eating up.